This video is brought to you by News Voice. The news is broken. Almost all US media is owned by just a handful of big corporations. Fake news is obviously a huge problem as well, and finding something unbiased can be really hard. News Voice is revolutionizing the news landscape. It's an app that gives you a personalized newsfeed by aggregating major news sites, as well as international and independent media, giving some much needed balance. Each news story shows multiple sources, which are all tagged with their bias and perspective. The news affects almost everything in our lives. What we hear and read shapes which persons we trust, what we eat, what we buy, how we vote, and even how we think. News Voice is created by its readers, as you can upvote stories that you find interesting so more people will see them. It's essentially a democratized platform for news. Plus, it saves you time. You get all the news and all the sources in one app, so that you can be better informed. Oh, and it's totally free. Anyway, get started with News Voice today, for free, through the link below. It's available on both Google Play and the Apple App Store. And let's get into the video. On 28th of August 2020, Shinzo Abe, the longest-serving prime minister and one of the most powerful in Japan's entire democratic period, announced that he has taken the decision to resign. He did so just 4 days after becoming the longest-serving prime minister in modern Japanese history. So why did he make that decision? Because Mr. Abe, 65, has an incurable disease known as ulcerative colitis, a disease that led to his resignation in his first term as Prime Minister in 2007. Of course, this time things are a little bit different. His situation does not seem to be as bad now as it was then, but the disease has been compounded by a bad political phase, a critical juncture in which 1 year before the elections, his popularity and that of his political circle is, for the first time, at rock bottom. Friends, when Shinzo Abe came to power at the end of 2012, he did so with two very clear objectives. On the one hand, carry out an economic revolution that would put an end to the eternal Japanese crisis, something that became popularly known as Abenomics. And on the other hand, to face the growing challenges in foreign policy. Mr. Abe's particular wish was to enable the land of the rising sun to compete with China's growing influence in the region and thus guarantee national security. These two key objectives were not only Shinzo Abe's goals, but the hope of practically the whole country. And so today, 8 years after his arrival in power, and taking into account that we are witnessing the end of an era, I think this time has come to ask ourselves some questions. What is the state of Japan today? And have all, or at least the main goals set by Shinzo Abe back in 2012 been achieved? Well, as we've told you previously, that's not the case. Shinzo Abe was unable to carry out his main objective. And indeed, his departure comes at a particularly tense time in terms of national security. Let's take a look.
The Awakening of Japan.
Friends, in a past video here on VisualPolitik, we talked about the upside of Japanese economy. The truth is that the last decade has not exactly been bad. During this time, the country has experienced somewhat of a revival, and indeed, although it's hard to believe, its real GDP in per capita terms has increased at practically the same rate as that of the United States, and even more than that of countries such as France and the United Kingdom. However, now the coronavirus crisis has changed everything. While Japan's health situation is holding up, its economic situation is worse than most developed countries. You see, the Japanese economy, like most of the world's major economies, has also been hit hard. Check it out.
Japan GDP contracts annualized 27.8% in April-June. Coronavirus pandemic causes biggest quarterly fall in post-war period.
However, Japan's problem goes much further than this. This pandemic has come at a particularly delicate time. Even before things were made difficult by COVID-19, the country was already in recession. A range of factors contributed to its slump. The conflict with South Korea, the trade war between the United States and China, and to top it off, a rise in consumer taxes at the end of 2019 had put the Japanese economy on the ropes. And then, on top of that, the coronavirus crisis. To give you an idea, the Japanese Economic Research Center estimates that, at best, if things go well, the Japanese economy will not recover to the level of GDP it had in 2018 until at least 2024. In other words, in terms of economic growth, that's 5 years down the drain, and that's the best case scenario. In other words, the coronavirus crisis has devoured all the economic growth achieved during Abe's years. So let's just say that this is something that has hamstrung one of Abe's main goals for Japan to escape its never-ending crisis. But wait a minute, in spite of of this, the truth is that during these years, Japan has changed a lot. In fact, if Shinzo Abe has done anything at all, it's been to pave the way to a huge transformation of Japanese society in the coming years. Now let me explain. When this prime minister came to power in 2012, he put an economic plan on the table, Abenomics, which had three main facets. On the one hand, reviving the economy in a short term with a super expansive monetary policy and increased public spending. Secondly, to take advantage of this temporary inertia to carry out the great changes that would make growth possible in the long term. And you know what? Things didn't go badly at all. Abe has been a champion of free trade agreements. Over the last 8 years, he has signed, among others, a very important free trade agreement with the European Union and kept alive the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement, despite the withdrawal of the United States by Donald Trump. Japan has also reformed the agricultural sector, until Abe's arrival, the most closed and protected sector in the country. Above all, he has driven enormous changes that have increased the working population even as the country's population is in decline. Hang on a minute, how on earth did they manage to get the workforce to grow when the country is losing population? Well, firstly, by promoting the incorporation of women into the labour market through, among other measures, government-funded childcare facilities and new types of contracts that facilitate a better work-life balance. The result is obvious. But that's not all. Incentives have also been put in place for many retirees to re-enter the labour market and, above all, immigration has been boosted. In fact, as we have already told you here on VisualPolitik, in this respect, Japan has started to break one of its main stumbling blocks, being a country very hostile to immigration. Something that could become key in a rapidly aging society such as this one. Just to give you an idea, between Abe's arrival at the end of 2012 and 2018, the immigrant population in Japan has more than doubled. In fact, today, 1 in 8 people who come of age in Tokyo were not born in the country. And that's not all. In April 2019, one of the most important reforms of Shinzo Abe's era came into force. A new immigration law that makes it much easier to work in the country and improves the rights of the foreign population. If we immerse ourselves in the numbers that the government puts forward, it may not seem like much until we realize that we are in one of the most historically hostile and closed countries in terms of immigration. In one way or another, the reform set in motion by Shinzo Abe is historic. Of course, the results have been very limited so far. In 2019, only 10% of immigration quota set by the government had arrived in the country. Because, friends, Japan is still a very complicated country to work in. Think about it for a moment. Long days, a huge cultural leap, and many misgivings about, if not clear, rejection of foreign workers who are often perceived as poor and a burden on the state. Now, let's be honest, unless you have a full wallet, you're probably more comfortable in another country. And even in the other case, if you are a qualified professional, it is likely that the very long working days, the few holidays, and the obsessive work culture are not likely to be that appealing to you. That, at least, is what the theory says, and it's also backed up by the surveys on foreign skilled workers. In any case, the issue now is that the coronavirus has sunk the popularity of the government and put all this progress on hold. And yes, it is true. In the battle against the virus, Japan has done well. With more than 125 million inhabitants, it had only registered just over 60,000 positive cases and just under 1,300 deaths at the time of making this video. These numbers are a far cry from the nightmare that has been and is being experienced in other countries around the world, just like Spain or the United States, Brazil, Mexico, or even Peru. However, despite this, the general feeling in the country is that the political leadership and faster, more agile measures to further reduce the impact of this pandemic have been lacking, and that is why the government's popularity has plummeted. But okay, let's skip the whole pandemic story. We've all heard enough of that. The truth is that beyond the management of this coronavirus, the end of Abe's era is overshadowed by what has perhaps been a great personal political failure and also, in some ways, a national one. I am referring to the country's inability to guarantee national security in regards to North Korea and also China. Because, friends, one of Abe's great political objectives was to amend Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution so that the country would abandon its pacifist policies, and that has not been achieved. In fact, despite having put all his weight behind it in recent years, Japan's defense still suffers from basically the same problems it had when Abe came to power. Listen up.
An increasingly complicated neighbourhood.
Northeast Asia is becoming an increasingly dangerous community. For example, let me ask you a question. Do you think that the North Korean crisis is already water under the bridge? Well, you are very, very wrong. Since May 2019, that's just over a year, the Pyongyang regime has conducted 33 missile tests, including the simulation of a saturation attack. This is an attack in which a lot of missiles are launched on the same target in order to exhaust the enemy's defenses. Not only that, North Korea began 2020 by announcing a tougher foreign policy approach, including the possibility of resuming long-range missile testing. And of course, it's not just North Korea. China, Xi Jinping's new China, seems to be taking an increasingly expansionist line while modernizing its armed forces at full speed. And look, while China is in open confrontation with Japan over the control of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, a group of uninhabited islands located very close to Taiwan, some think tanks and pro-government newspapers supported by Beijing are now also questioning Japan's sovereignty over the island of Okinawa itself, an island with nearly 1.5 million inhabitants that is key to Japan's defense. Okinawa is also the most important US military base in the region. And of course, as we mentioned, all this is happening while the Chinese army has embarked on a huge program to modernize its armed forces. For example, estimates suggest that by the end of this decade, that is, by 2030, the Chinese Air Force could have up to 500 operational 5th-generation fighters, J-20 and J-31, which would far exceed the projected 5th-generation capability of Japan's Air Force. The land of the rising sun has signed off the acquisition of a fleet of 147 F-35 units, which will make it the second largest fleet of this type of aircraft in the world. We are talking about a gigantic program worth more than $20 billion. But no, it's not just about the jet fighters. Amongst many other pieces of equipment, the Chinese military is also developing a new generation of ballistic missiles, including supersonic missiles, a force that could shatter Japan's current defenses. And there's more. As Chinese General Ma Xiaochan stated in 2016, they are even developing a new long-range stealth bomber. And it is precisely because of this deployment that Shinzo Abe was always clear that his main goal, his #1 objective in his second term as prime minister, has to be to put an end to Japan's institutional pacifism and to bolster Japan's decimated self-defense forces. And yes, progress has been made. We will certainly talk about it at length in a future video here on the channel. Under Abe's government, the Japanese armed forces have bought new equipment and even set up their first overseas military base in Djibouti. But in practice, everything remains basically the same. Let's say that Japan has not managed to develop autonomous systems against the new threats. Its military budget remains relatively small, almost 7 times smaller than China's. And Shinzo Abe has failed to push through a change in Article 9 of the Constitution to put an end to the pacifist doctrine that has governed the country since the end of the Second World War.
1. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. 2. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution.
And while things are not the same, in fact, they could potentially be even worse. To date, a bulwark of Japanese defense has been its alliance with the United States, a country that maintains 78 military installations in the country. These are facilities for which Japan pays nearly $4 billion a year, over 8% of its entire military budget. For decades, the basic idea was that Japan would take over the defense, while American forces would take over the action. This is known as the shield and sword model. Japan carried the shield and United States the sword. However, the Trump administration has changed everything. Now, the feeling in many countries like this is that they have to start taking care of their own business. And friends, it's not just that the Trump administration has cast doubt on America's commitment to the land of the rising sun, as, for example, when it demanded that the Japanese government pay more money to keep US troops on the ground. As if Japan did not already foot almost 90% of the bill, or as if these deployments were not also advantageous for the United States itself. No, it's not just that. There is also another issue. You see, following that shield and sword model and responding to the demands of the Trump administration itself, some 3 or 4 years ago, Japan decided to purchase the Lockheed Martin Aegis Ashore system for over $4 billion. A system that moves the Aegis warship-based ballistic missile defense system to land. The idea was to complement the 2 layers of Japan's current missile defense system, which consists of the sea level with 7 Aegis destroyers and the land-based Patriot missile system with land-based installations. It was the formula with which Japan wanted to protect itself from the North Korean threat and a potential Chinese threat. However, this past June 2020, to everyone's surprise, and in what has been one of his last great decisions as Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe had this program thrown out. He cancelled it.
June 15th, 2020. Japan suspends Aegis Ashore deployment, pointing to cost and technical issues.
The anti-missile system on which the United States had embarked them on simply does not seem to serve much purpose, at least not for Japan's interests. Because of course, if we're talking about the interests of Lockheed Martin, that's a different story.
When the government said that Japan needed Aegis on the ground, we already knew that missile defense was not effective in all situations. Eventually, it would take almost a decade to deploy Aegis ashore. In the meantime, our adversaries would be developing more effective weapons designed to weaken missile defense. Haigo Seto, professor at Takushoku University and vice president of the Institute of World Studies.
You see, around 2016 and 2017, the validity of the anti-missile system was already greatly damaged when North Korea simulated its first saturation attack, a strategy that could apparently overcome this entire system relatively easily. And since then, the development of missile technology and hypersonic attack vehicles, that is, vehicles that operate at 5 times the speed of sound, being carried out by countries such as China and Russia, has brought all the limitations of an anti-missile system, like the one the United States has sold to Japan, into the spotlight. And what can I say? The feeling on the ground in Japan is that they increasingly feel American politicians are treating them like some kind of cash cow, an ATM machine to make gold for the US military industry. But the fact is that all this leads us to a key question. If Japan has suspended the anti-missile system, how do they propose to defend themselves now? Well, Shinzo Abe himself made this very clear last June 18th when he said the following at a press conference.
We should renew our discussion of adequate deterrence we need, considering North Korea's missile technology that has advanced since the time we introduced our missile defense systems. The question is if we should stay within the boundary when enemy capability is dramatically advancing. Shinzo Abe.
Deterrence, that's the key word. In recent months, the Japanese government has decided to open up this Pandora's box, that of being able to equip the self-defense forces with sufficient military capacity to attack an enemy preventatively if they feel they are at risk of being attacked. In other words, we are basically returning to the debate on Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. The problem is that today, the vast majority of Japanese society is simply against it.
69% oppose change to Japanese Constitution's war-renouncing Article 9, poll shows.
In short, this is the great failure of, or at least the great political disappointment of Shinzo Abe. Not only has he failed to change the country's pacifist character, he has also failed to prepare it to face the new threats. And even now, at the end of his term of office, he has given up the anti-missile shield. That is, in terms of national security, and despite this being a priority issue, the country's structural weakness is almost as great as when Abe came to power in 2012. Progress has been made, and we will tell you about it in forthcoming videos, but in structural terms, things have not improved much. Friends, Shinzo Abe and Xi Jinping came to power at almost the same time. The Japanese Prime Minister took the baton barely a month after the Chinese leader did. His mission? To make Japan rival the growing power of China. There are clearly areas where he has not succeeded. In this video, we wanted to tell you how Japan has changed and how it has not changed under Abe's leadership. But now it's your turn. What do you think Japan should do? Will Abe's resignation undo the decision to break the US missile shield? Leave your answers in the comments. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. And also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll be seeing you in the next video.